Welcome to the Voice of Bold Business Radio, the show about ways to stay competitive in a changing market, break through business plateaus, and respond to the changing expectations of today's customers. Your host, Jess Dewell, is a rapid growth entrepreneur, consultant, and business advocate with a 20-year track record of business excellence. She candidly discusses how to achieve your growth strategy and realize your company's unfulfilled potential. Now, here's Jess.
Everybody, it is so great to be with you today on Tuesday, March 26th. For those of you who don't know, tomorrow is my birthday. So this is an extra special show because I'm on the road. I'm interviewing a great, amazing person, Chris Natzke, today. And on top of that, tomorrow I get to celebrate my birthday. And so, my birthday celebration starts one day early. It's amazing and fun. You're in the right place for conversations about the current needs that we as business leaders face regarding technology, customer expectations, and quickly changing markets. This program is about what it means to reach short-term goals and increase our confidence in long-term positioning. This is program 214, Mind of a Champion. And this is important because everybody talks about mindset, but there's so much variation in what that actually means, what it means, what to embody. And I am super excited to be able to talk with Chris today and share some things with you so we can dig into that, pull back the covers, and talk about how it's not just this thing that we do, it's a way that we live. And Chris Natzke is a black belt. He is a leadership speaker. He is a coach. I saw him for the first time at a conference that I went to at the invitation of a friend. And when Chris got up and he did his talk, I'm like, well, this is good. I think this is going to be some of the same old stuff. But within 2 minutes, he had me captivated. And by the end, I was ready to break boards. And I did that with you, Chris.
You did.
Welcome to the Voice of Bold Business Radio.
Oh, it's great to be here, Jess. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and so what made you decide that board breaking was a way to really get in touch with who we are right now in this moment?
Well, you know, it's an interesting story. The conference that you were at, the organizer of that conference approached me several years before, and he said, I'm looking to do an experience. Could you do a board breaking experience? And I said, well, in teaching martial arts for the last 4 decades, I said, yeah, that's something that I do. But I wanted to put it into a context that it wasn't just about the physical, that there was a real emotional component around it, as well as having it connote to other, real strategies that we could utilize in our everyday life. So it acts as a metaphor. And after I did the first session with him, I had people come up and go, so this is what you do professionally? You travel around the country and do this? And I said, yeah, I think that's what I do now. So that's how it started.
Of course I do that.
That's right. Of course I do.
Of course I do that. So talk to me more about the emotional impact, how that plays a part in what's in between our ears.
Well, I'll tell you what, to me, that's the most important part of it, the emotional aspect and the uplifting and up-leveling of our mindsets, because I could literally teach someone how to break a board in 5 minutes from a physical standpoint. But what I wanted that experience to do is have them really take a deep look at what is their vision, because many times we're so busy that gets cloudy for us. But importantly, what are the things that are holding you back from achieving that vision? Because oftentimes we don't even want to look at that. So the idea in the board breaking experience was to have them get really clear about their vision, but then identify what has been holding them back up until now and use the board break as a metaphor for moving through that once and for all.
That's so great. It makes me think about that because we forget. And emotion is coming back. Emotion is a thing that we're starting to realize is more important than we've given it credit to in our work. And when we want to do good work, emotion is a part of that. Yet in many businesses today, it's still kind of like that thing that's in the corner that we know is there and nobody wants to talk about. And so what does, how do you bridge that gap for people who recognize it, but the culture is so set and it's not really welcome, even though it's necessary and known that it's needed?
Right. Well, I just really have come to believe over the last decade how important being a leader from a heart-centered place really is. I mean, because we make our decisions and we make our breakthroughs when we have that connection and we really listen to our hearts. And it's not to say that the mind or the brain or whatever is bad. I think it's a coherence that you have between the head and the heart. But really, I've been actually studying some of this over the last couple of months, and the heart actually knows things that are going to occur long before the head ever happens in the head. We sense this. And if you notice, some of the best leaders out there are the ones that have a tremendous ability to connect, whether it's one-on-one or in a group of 500 to 1,000 people. They know how to connect with people. They know how to tell their stories of vulnerability. They know how to inspire people to break through those as well. And so I think when we get just totally into our minds, what happens is we cut ourselves off from a huge resource that we have to really impact our world.
Oh, there's so many things I want to say right now. I'm pausing to listen, to let my heart decide, so my brain. And it's interesting because we do have to flip that on its head, don't we? I mean, any of us that grew up with any business person or anybody who worked in an office around us learn that we leave our emotions at the door and we put our head down and we work hard. And then we also recognize, the next generation that came after that recognized, well, that's not right. That's not cool. I'm hurting more. I'm tired more. I'm not getting the results I want. I'm not the person I want to be in my life, let alone at work. And so when you think about this, and I'm going to tie it now back to the board breaking, and we were talking you briefly brought up limiting beliefs. So let's start there. Do we all have limiting beliefs?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, we have tens of thousands of thoughts per day that go through our minds, and the vast majority of those are proven to be negative thoughts. And when you think about how we evolved as human beings, we survived as a result of having and recognizing negative things. I mean, when we were out in the wild, and if we couldn't recognize danger, we wouldn't survive. So that's something that's really hardwired in us, and it can help us. But when it begins to drive our decisions and our way of being, that's where it gets us in trouble. Because, the real leaders, the real people that are having success and happiness in life, I believe we're careful, we're understanding what the dangers are, but we live life as if it's supporting us. It's like they say, and I think it's in Egypt, you have to trust in God, but you still tie up your camel, right? So, you have to be cautious about that, but not let the fear drive you.
Okay. And if we were to stay with that, and we're going to say, don't let fear drive you. It's easy to say.
Yeah.
It's easy to believe.
Yeah.
But it's really not that. It's really hard to do. And so what is that first step?
It's simple to do, more difficult, or simple to say, more difficult to do. I think the one thing for myself and also the people that I've worked with, both from a martial arts standpoint and then also in my life coaching business, is that we have a tendency to avoid fear. We ignore the fear. We're embarrassed by the fear. And really that fear is energy that is inside of us to keep us sharp, keep us alert, and to drive us forward. And the way to really dissolve fear is to lean into it 100%. As scary, as uncomfortable as that might be, it's about leaning into it, because there's always a nugget there for us to discover. But, myself included, we as human beings, we don't necessarily like to be uncomfortable, and fear brings us discomfort. But when you really want to be at it, there's always a nugget in there for us to utilize. And it's kind of like the idea that, the brain can't differentiate between anxiety and excitement. So, next time you're in a situation like, oh, I am so anxious about this, I'm so worried about it. What if you just said to yourself, I'm excited? Because scientists have done the brain scan side by side. They light up the same way. It's our interpretation and it's our perception of it.
And now I've heard that before, and I've heard you say that before. And so basically if I were to reflect back to you, I hear you saying, when we feel fear, say something with a word that has an excited connotation instead. Yeah. And it allows you to lean in, which means it allows you to take that next step when otherwise you might be paralyzed or want to run the other direction.
That's right. Well, and this is now become an old cliche, but what we resist persists. So the more we try to push that down, there's a great author named Debbie Ford. She wrote a book called Dark Side of the Light Chasers. And she talks about the shadow side that we have, these fears that we have. And the more you push them down, it's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. And pretty soon it's going to come up in ways that you're probably not too happy with. So you might as well face it.
And the quicker we face it, I'm telling you, this whole concept of ripping the Band-Aid off.
Well, quite honestly, and I say this, and I just want to be clear when I say this, I still have fears and I still deal with this stuff every day. But what I found is that the more I avoid it, the bigger it gets, and it's almost always worse in my mind than what it actually ends up being.
That is so, this is very succinct. Look who's here, everybody.
Hi there.
This is Mike. Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Hello, everyone.
Mike is one of the founders of MicroComp, and I told him where I would be, and he could come find me in the lobby. So what we're talking about is, this is Chris Natzke. He's a black belt and leadership coach. I've done board-breaking exercises with him in the past, and so we're talking about excellence when it comes to mindset.
Okay.
Is there, well, I'm going to ask you a question, which is, can you think of a story when you were creating MicroComp where you were like, I know what excellence looks like and we're going to go for it? And you don't have to know the answer right now. I can let you think about it. I'll just put you on the spot. Because we're going to switch and start talking about excellence right here. What are the elements of excellence as you see them, Chris? From your work, from your perspective in the life journey and the way that you choose to be a champion every day?
Yeah, well, what I talk about in my work and in my book is I have what I call 7 qualities of black belt leadership, or 7 qualities of black belt excellence. And it really first starts with your vision. You need to have a great vision, one that excites you and expands you. The next is about, I call being the change you wish to see, because we live in a world where we are very much awarded for our doingness, if you will. And there's nothing wrong with doing. We have to get things done, but most people look at life from a perspective of have, do, be. When I have enough money, then I'll do what I want to do and I'll be happy. When I have the growth in my company, I'll do the expansion, I'll be successful. But what I found is champions understand you need to flip those words around. You need to look at life from a perspective of be, do, have. So if you want to have a quality that you want to be feeling and experiencing, you start being courageous, patient, trustworthy, whatever, do the things that support that, and then you can have what you want. Because it always starts from within us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Here, a concept or anything?
Yeah, I think it depends on whether you're looking at like a particular product or service or something like that, or you're really talking more about the journey, because I find that if you're trying to do something, it doesn't matter what it is, it's very difficult to reach your ideal of excellence on the first iteration. It's probably just not going to happen. You're always going to have this vision in your head that is so much substantially farther than you have the capabilities, the resources, or the time to be able to do. And it's really just an iterative process. So like, for example, MicroComp, I can give you a very simple example here where, like, we've got our name badges. Like the first year, we hacked everything together and it was all on paper. I printed it in my basement and they were passable, but it wasn't like it was fantastic. And now we've got badges that, if you look at it, there's little details and they changed over time. So for example, like there's the name on the front and the company down below, but there's a swivel here. So when it flips over, we've still got the name there, but the schedule is down below. The schedule is actually upside down so that I can flip it up and I can.
Nice.
So it's an iterative process over time. And, that excellence, and, not that a name badge is a fantastic, awesome thing that I aspired to have an awesome badge or anything, but those things get tweaked over time. And to shoot for excellence on your first attempt, you're almost setting yourself up for failure. But if you recognize that it is a process, it's a journey, and it takes its multiple iterations, you do something, this didn't work. Or you look at industrial design, for example. I could point to different companies who've done things and they create a product and then they realize, this little piece of it breaks very easily. So let's change that. Let's make it better. It's just that process. It's like finding out what's broken or doesn't work quite as well as it should, making changes, tweaking it, and making it better.
Yeah. What you're talking about, Mike, is what we would call in martial arts the concept of kanai, which is constant and never-ending improvement. So as we're taking students through, I'm a martial arts instructor, as we're taking people through the black belt process, which also very much applies in life, it's about how can you continuously expand and get better. When I think about it, I've had about 1,000 students I've been able to promote to black belt over my career. And I can think of only 2 of them that came to me that I thought had everything that it took to be a black belt. All the balance, all the concentration, the focus, strength, etc. Only 2. But that other 998, they didn't, but they just kept showing up, right? They just kept showing up. And we have another saying in martial arts, we say a black belt is a white belt that never quit. So as simple of an example as that name tag, you're right there. That's what keeps us going, is that constant and never-ending improvement.
Yeah, and if you quit, you never get there. And that's
right. Absolutely.
Too quickly, and you won't achieve that excellence, whether it's a name badge or a black belt.
Right. Exactly.
I like this. The devil is in the details, and so is our integrity, and that's what we can take pride in, that experience that we're creating, whatever that is, and recognizing we don't know everything. So let's take a shot and let's figure out what that is so that we can figure out how to take the next shot and the next shot.
Well, it's interesting that you use the word integrity, because that's the next quality of black belt leadership, is integrity and personal integrity, and not just from a standpoint of being honest with others, which is incredibly important, but it's also about being honest with ourselves. You know, being able to take really honest looks at ourselves, and also see where we have it. What I think holds us back is not the huge integrity breaches or the energy leaks, so to speak. It's the small ones that we don't notice, like having holes in a bucket and things that we continuously do over time. And pretty soon, you know, like I tell my students, all you have to be, if you took off from Los Angeles to go to Honolulu, Hawaii in a flight, and the pilot was 1 degree south off, he would not end up in Maui, he would end up in New Zealand, right? So all it takes is to be a little bit off and do that over time. Conversely though, if you do the right things over time, they can compound into great results.
Integrity is one of my favorite words. It's also a word that when you ask people what it means, there's a scale and there's this spectrum, and every single way that people define integrity is absolutely positively correct with what they were modeled, what they were shown, and how they choose to do things. And so when people use the word integrity and then they say something, I listen to what they say after so that I can figure out, how do I show up in this communication? How do I show up in this moment to get it out of my head and get it into action, whatever that action is. Yeah.
Chris, I actually have a question for you. Like, what's your impression of, I guess I've interacted with a lot of entrepreneurs over the years, and you said personal integrity and believing in something and, you know, being honest with not just other people, but with yourselves. What I find is there's a certain amount of self-delusion with entrepreneurs. And don't get me wrong.
Healthy.
In some cases it is healthy. In some cases it is not. And the question is, like, how, you know, it's not that it's this, you know, how important is that? Because obviously I think it's very important, but where do you draw that line between the self-delusion that is healthy versus the self-delusion that is not? Because you can be optimistic about something but have no data. But you can also be, I've been in this situation myself, and I've seen other people's in this situation where you're neck deep in something and there are facts that are basically stacked against you and people are still optimistic. And as an entrepreneur, you kind of have to be, but at the same time, there's the, you know, objectively, people may look at that and say, look, this is crazy, but they're going to say that you're crazy, the entire spectrum. So it's like, where do you look for data points, or how do you classify them in a way that is like, this is optimistic and healthy versus this is detrimental, and yes, you're optimistic, but it's not a good thing right now?
Yeah. Well, two things are coming to mind. Is number one is, I think that as entrepreneurs, and I know I've been guilty of this myself, we don't always do a good job at the basics, which in martial arts, you know, a black belt is a master of the basics, right? And so we don't do the basic things like looking at our business. We have this huge long-term plan, but we don't break it down into smaller bits that we can really we can process and we can look at closely to see if we're on track. And so as a result of that, we tend to get off track, and we get to a point where things are pretty nasty by the time we have to deal with them, because we've been ignoring things. Because it takes courage to look at the numbers of whether the numbers are good or bad, right? It takes some courage. I think the other thing that holds us back along that delusional piece is we also don't know when to ask for help. And as an entrepreneur, we're very much centered in, you know, I'm going to pull myself up on my bootstraps. I'm do this, and that's all fantastic, and it's necessary. And sometimes being vulnerable and asking for help is more courageous than anything. In one of my teachings that I've done throughout the years, our saying always was 100% strength comes from 100% vulnerability. So there are times where it's necessary to ask for help, and entrepreneurs aren't always good at doing that.
Right. And I love the way you kind of framed both of those answers to that question, because I totally agree with you, because I think that there's, when you're looking at a particular challenge as an entrepreneur, and you're being optimistic about it, and the lack of data, the absence of data, that's one thing. That's probably the healthy kind. But if you are still optimistic and all signs point against you, like, that's not healthy. But right. I think a lot of entrepreneurs tend to be on the optimistic side, kind of regardless of how things are actually going.
Totally. Well, and it was just making me think, one of the things that I do with my clients, particularly that are business owners, great book that changed my perception of business was The E-Myth that I read years ago by Michael Gerber, The Entrepreneurial Myth. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but it basically speaks to the idea that most people who are entrepreneurs have this delusion, and they think, oh my gosh, I love baking pies. If I just bake pies, everything in my life will be amazing. But they don't realize that over time, they've just gotten themselves into a job that they hate, and they work for a lunatic, and it's them, right? So I think that having those systems in place are really important. And you do that in martial arts. You have systems. You have a belt rank system every 3 months. You're taking a look at where your progress is, and it's important for you to be able to adapt and move and change based on that feedback.
Okay, Chris. Well, it appears as if Jess has lost her signal from the convention site. This might be a great opportunity for us to take an audience question. This one is from Lana. How to cultivate the resilience to keep on going, developing ourselves for success. So it's a question about resilience.
Well, I'll take that. I think that the best way that I have been able to experience that in my own life, as well as do it in the students and the clients that I've trained and coached, is resilience is a daily practice. It's not a decision that you make and then put it into a desk drawer. It's something you actually practice daily. And putting together daily activities, daily practices that you can do on a very frequent basis starts to build that resilience muscle. Because it's very easy to get off track, but when you start to develop really powerful habits, pretty soon that activity begins to take you through that, and you're not only resilient on the inside, you're doing it through your actions. So they combine to support each other.
And when I think about resilience, and I think about what Chris just said, it makes me recognize how many times I fell down. It makes me recognize, am I willing to figure out what there is to learn in this moment so that I can apply it to what's next? Because I might fall down again, but I also might learn to fall down a little softer.
And something that's awesome, Justin. You just reminded me of something. I wish I would have created this myself. There's a great book called Rethinking Positive Thinking by a doctor named Gabrielle Ottinger, and she has a concept that she calls WHOOP, and it's a 4-step process. And it kind of speaks to what Mike was talking about, which is this delusion. And WHOOP stands for your wish. The outcome that you want to have is the O. The second O stands for the obstacle. And then the P stands for the plan. And what it basically says is get really clear on what you want. What's the outcome you want to have? But then identify what you believe the obstacles are going to be along the path and have a plan to deal with the obstacle. Because most of us know how to create a plan that's on a straight northeast line, but we get off track when the obstacles pop up. And if we haven't planned in advance how to deal with the obstacle, it can totally get us off track.
Let's use hashtag BBB Radio. Join in this amazing conversation with Chris Natzke and our special co-host today, as long as he chooses to be here, Mike Tabor. I call you Tabor. It's Tabor. Tabor. Mm-hmm.
It's okay. The telemarketers get it wrong too.
See, at least a little better than a telemarketer.
They wouldn't have self-corrected.
That's true.
Okay, well, here's another question. This one is from Carlos. You talk about integrity, but can it be learned or taught? I always believe that integrity is something we are born with, according to Carlos, and then we develop it further from there.
Well, if I may, I'm going to go back to my martial art world Having trained tens of thousands of students, particularly young students, I have a very strong feeling that integrity can be cultured and developed, particularly when young people are put in a positive environment and they see that that is a positive and effective way of dealing with life. I teach the martial art of Taekwondo, and we have what are called the Taekwondo tenets, and they're courtesy, integrity, perseverance, self-control, and indomitable spirit. So integrity is the second of that whole listing. And so it's something that when I was teaching martial arts full time, we were constantly talking about that with our students, and I've seen some amazing transformations in kids in particular that I know can lead into adulthood. So I'm a little biased, obviously, but I believe it can certainly be developed. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, it's totally part of my story. And, and so, I'm just thinking, I'm having pictures of kids that had come into my mind that when they started with me, they were having some struggles. They were having some difficulties. But in my story is I had an instructor who totally claimed greatness for me. He told me, I will make you a champion. He saw greatness in me. And as soon as he said it, I believed it. And when you have someone that's that influential in your life, you yearn to role model. And I think all kids yearn to have that role model and to role model those behaviors. And I'll say another thing. I think we're nothing, even when we're adults, we're nothing more than big kids anyway. So we yearn for that as adults. Right, Mike? In your leadership, your teams, they yearn for that, for you role modeling that. And because your company is a reflection of what you're demonstrating on the top. So.
Yeah, and I think there's two different ways that integrity can actually go. There's the innate integrity, I'll say, which is people feel like I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do. And then there's the people who will go in a particular direction. Although it's the right thing to do, they see it as a generally good outcome for themselves. So it's I'll say somewhat of a selfish integrity at that point. But, I think there's two different classifications of that. And that's probably why there's a little bit of confusion about, can this be taught? And yes, it can, but is the person who is, performing whatever action or providing whatever service, there's reasons that they do something. And it may seem like they have integrity in a general sense, and they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart. But I mean, in some cases it can be like, hey, this is the best outcome for me. And although it may be for somebody else as well, it's a natural byproduct of that. I do agree with you. I think that integrity can be taught. I mean, I've taught, soccer with little kids and stuff like that. And, there's certain things that you should and shouldn't do in soccer. I mean, you don't go up and kick the other kid, even though you could. It's like the goalie's down on the ball. You could kick the ball. You probably shouldn't, though. Right. So it's just like, there's a lot of things that go into that. And I agree with you. I definitely feel it can be taught, but I believe that it's easier to teach it when people are younger than when they're older, because they've formed these habits.
I would agree.
Breaking them of those habits of, a lack of integrity is probably a lot more difficult than when they are younger.
You're here. #VBB Radio. We'll be back right after this.
You are listening to the voice of Bold Business Radio. In every program, we share stories, tips, and concepts that benefit short-term goals and increase confidence in long-term positioning. For additional perspectives on your growth strategy, Jess Dewell is your business advisor and consultant. Go to voiceofboldbusiness.com and click the Find Out More button to get started. Now, back to Jess.
Thank you so much, Scott. I have to tell you, it's fun being in other places because you never know how the conversation will go by who shows up. So we had some concept, Chris, of what today was going to look like. And the program so far is revolving around these concepts of mindset, everybody. The mindset of what are qualities of excellence, which we've touched on, I believe, 4 of the 7 black belt leadership qualities. We talked about integrity and innate integrity and different ways that we might experience integrity. And, it comes down to the action that we take, doesn't it, Chris?
Sure does. Yeah, and in fact, none of this, and this is something that I know that I shared with you when you did the board breaking experience, and I do it every keynote talk that I give as well, is all this stuff that I share, and if people gain value from it and they take notes and they maybe had fun in the experience, that's all well and good, but it really doesn't do any good unless we take some action. And I'm a huge believer in small incremental actions done over time. Many people, they bust out of the gates and try to make huge changes, but then they're not sustainable. And then they end up being in the same place or even worse than they were at the beginning. But small actions done consistently over time, I know compound into huge results. And I've seen it in martial arts. I've seen it in life coaching clients. I've seen it in my own life. And so I just can't say enough about that.
Okay, I wonder if we've lost Jess again. Would this be a good time for another question? Why don't we do that, Chris, and
Sure.
We'll let Jess's connection come back. This one is from Stephen. I kind of like this one too. How much control do we have over how much control do we have over our own destiny, and what are the variables?
Yeah. Well, I'll answer it first this way, Stephen. I think it's a great question. I think that there are different schools of thought, and some would say that we have complete control over our destiny based on our thoughts, beliefs, and actions, and others would say those are all predetermined. However, I think the one thing I'd like to say is we may not have 100% control over what occurs in our life, but we always have 100% control on how we respond to it. And I'd like to create a distinction that I talk about in my work, the distinction between a reaction and a response. So a reaction is something that occurs from an emotional, guttural level, if you will, and it's basically out of our control. But a response is something that we actually are mindful about, whether it's in a confrontation we might have before we share what's really on our mind, or it's a stressful situation, or it's something that is really challenging us. We may not be able to change the outcome, but we always have the ability to respond to it in a productive way.
That concept of response is so important in the sense that we are able to really work on that. And if we're working on that as a skill, we can see the results in those around us and within ourselves faster than we see results that we can measure, like number of positive interactions, number of the days before we're ready to take our next martial arts test, because those can be pretty stressful. But in that daily opportunity of that response, are there, if you were to break it down, how we respond, can you give us a few steps of what goes into that response so that we could start practicing that and how we choose to respond instead of react?
Totally. Well, I spoke to a little bit before when I talked about Gabrielle Adinger's work about the concept of whoop. I mean, having a plan for when things come up helps us be able to get out of that emotional state and be able to take good action if we have something planned in advance. Now, that's not always the case, right? So I do a lot of self-defense classes that I teach, and we deal with the adrenal response. And the adrenal response when someone is attacked was actually put into our cells as a means of protecting. It was there to help us, right? It's where the fight or flight comes from. But what's happened over decades, actually millennium, not decades, but a millennium, is we've developed a third response, which is freeze. And that's what many of us do when we're dealing with struggle, when we're dealing with stressful situations. So one of the first things that I do in that case is we encourage people to be calm and breathe. One of the first things you can do is just allow things to settle when you have, obviously, if you have to have the time. If you're being attacked, you may not be able to have that response time. But when you're in that stressful situation in the business world, take some time to be calm and breathe, and then look at it as best you can objectively without the story. Because so many times it's easy to get into the story. This is what he said, this is what she did, versus pulling back and going, what's really occurring here? And when you can look at what's really occurring, now you can start making some empowered choices.
Objective, it was objective without the story.
That's correct.
That is repeating, because we can be subjective.
Oh.
We can also be, I think I'm back. I noticed something. We're going to just pause a minute.
Well, Jess, you're coming in and out, but you're there enough that we think that we can, at least Chris, can you go ahead and get the gist of some of the things Jess is saying?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I heard Jess say is this is kind of playing back to this idea of the way we look at things subjectively versus objectively. And more times than not, when we are looking at things from an emotional and subjective point of view within the story, as I would call it, we don't tend to make our best decisions, either from a professional standpoint, a personal standpoint, a leadership standpoint. And so it doesn't mean that emotion is bad by any means. We want to have emotions. We want to let them flow freely, but we just want to make sure that we're being objective in terms of when we're looking at challenges so we can deal with them in the best way possible.
This is fantastic. I do think it's time for another audience question, Scott. Is there one more that we can pop in here? Hashtag BBB Radio.
Yes, there is. And this one is from Kate. Let me call it up here. And Kate asks, how can we develop how can we develop the mind of a champion to the team, especially if the team is old-minded? Not old in age, but rather old in their way of thinking.
Yeah, it's a great question, and of course, without knowing more about the situation, I'm just going to take a shot at this question. I think that one of the best ways in order to get people in alignment is you first have to enroll them in the positiveness of the vision and how it not only serves the collective, but it can also serve them. So if you're making a change in your organization just for change's sake, and you may understand the benefits of it, but you aren't clearly communicating that to your people, it's going to be really hard to shift, particularly if it's something that they've done it the same way they've always done it. But if you can communicate them the why of what's behind your motivation for change and the benefit for the company and for them, et cetera, now you start to create an opening. And I'm not saying it's easy work at all, because many times we can get caught in our own ruts, if you will, and our own modes of behavior. But when people start to see change and they start to see the benefits of change, that's when they're going to be more apt to making those up levels.
And to add to that, there's this concept of, well, the team stays the same, but the people change. And that's a little bit of a farce. No, I'm going to go straight out and say it. That's a big farce. Every time somebody on the team changes, we have a new team.
Right. I would agree. But how many times do leaders just make changes and they don't enroll the people that are following them in the reason for the change? We're making this change because I said it, et cetera. And I'm not saying that everything needs to be divulged, but what I'm saying is when you get people emotionally enrolled in something, the chances of them being able to adjust that behavior and change their practices moves up exponentially than just a straight mandate. And if you don't think that's true, try teaching 5-year-olds martial arts sometime. If you don't have them enrolled in what you're doing, doesn't matter how big you are, you're not going to be able to get them to move. And I think adults are the same way.
Yes. I always like looking at children as an example, specifically because it's easier. Give them a pass. We allow them to be a little bit more of their whole self. And I challenge everybody that's listening to be able to give themselves that same space.
Well, I've got another question in queue. Are you ready for one? Okay. And actually, this is a question from me, and that is, Chris, what's the best advice you ever got? And then what's the worst advice you ever got in your opinion?
Okay. Well, this is what just popped into my head. Some of the best advice I ever got is when I was opening up my business, and I think maybe many entrepreneurs out there can relate to this. When you open up a business, you're basically the chief cook and the bottle washer. You do everything. And when I opened up my martial arts studio 20 plus years ago, I taught all the classes, I answered the phone, I swept the floors, I did all the enrollments. You could not pry anything out of my kung fu grip because I felt no one could do it as well as I could. The fact of the matter is that even though I had high skill in all those areas, since I was so stretched, I couldn't put 100% focus on any one of them. So I was doing them all from a mediocre standpoint. So I had to start getting help. I had to start developing people and delegating the work within the business. And even if they were half as good as I was initially, their 50% was still better than the 10% I was able to give because I was so stretched. So the best advice I ever got was to delegate. The second best advice I ever got was in the competitive arena when I was in the business arena, when a competitor moved about a mile down the road from me, a competitive martial arts school. And that was about 5 years into the business. We were just starting to take off. And I went into complete panic. I thought, oh my gosh, the business is going to crumble. This was the #1 martial art chain in Denver that moved a mile down the road from me. And I went to two of my mentors and they said to me, Chris, you can't change the fact that that person's opening up. You can't go firebomb the place. The only thing you can do is you can make yourself and your operation better. So I got my entire team together, told them what was up. I said, this place is going to be cleaner. We're going to answer the phones better. The classes are going to be better. And guess what happened? That year was the #1 growth year in my 17 years of owning that business. We went up 33%. I hired 3 guys on full time because we were focused on what we could do versus what we couldn't do. So those are the 2 best pieces of advice.
I'm listening to your story, and it's interesting because it's almost as the instinct was to protect. It was to contract. It was to, right? And when we do that, we miss out because all of our focus goes on, what are they doing like me? How are we different from each other? Blah, 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 blah. I can't believe, which is never objective. And that emotion just is so deep-seated. So what I also then heard within this was this concept of I let go. And when I let go, my attention and my focus amplified the good, amplified the possible.
In both those cases, actually, the first case where I was starting to delegate and create staff members in order to help me build the business, it definitely amplified because now it was a collective group, and I personally love collaborating in teams. So I started going, wow, I really enjoy this. Also, I can look back and I can think of all those individuals and I know what an impact it had in their lives, right? And in the second instance, the same thing happened. We collaborated as a team toward a goal that was positive. It wasn't, I told them, I said, I want none of you to be bad-mouthing the competition down the road. I don't want any of that. We're focused on us. We're focused on us. And I guess I knew I was on the right track. A couple of years ago, I listened to an interview by Oprah Winfrey, and she basically said the same thing. She said when her talk show came out, and there were 20 other talk shows, and everyone was like, oh, he's doing this, she's doing that. She goes, stop. We're going to focus on what we can do. And I think she turned out okay.
I love it when we have people that are around us that have shared the same advice, and they give us that guidepost that we really are doing, that we are being disciplined. We are taking the actions that must be taken regardless of what's going on around us with the right data, right? We're not going on blind faith. We are going on belief, and we're able to make conscious, clear decisions that we can also adjust.
That's right.
I'll tell you what, Chris, there's this word that's out there right now in business. It's called pivot. Let's pivot. Let's pivot. And I heard a good definition recently of a pivot could just be just like the sprinkler in your yard that just shifts just a little bit at a time. And I said, I buy that, but I've never seen that in practice. When we pivot, in my experience over the last 20 years, anybody who pivots, they're taking a right turn or a 180-degree turn, and they're forgetting about all the work that they've already done. And they're like, let's just start over. I'm like, if your work was good work, don't give it up. And if your work was so bad that you have to pivot 180 degrees, what were you doing with it in the first place?
I would agree. You know, I was also thinking, Scott had asked what the worst advice I ever got.
Yeah?
And I don't know if this was advice, but this was a mindset. And it goes in conjunction with the last two stories that I shared. I got into a mindset where all I felt I needed to do was to up-level my staff and train them very powerfully and then let them go. And I think that there's a great nuance when you're an entrepreneur of empowering people, but you still want to be inspecting what you expect. And so what I did in my case is I had a great staff that I had created and trained. They were doing great work, but I went to the other extreme where I basically ignored what they were doing. I wasn't checking in. And I just remember very distinctly at a meeting one day and asking about a certain process that was key to our business and having my person go, we just don't do that anymore. And I was like, what? And as a result, I mean, after an audit, there were several $1,000s out there that hadn't been collected because we didn't go through this process. But I had to take responsibility for that because I had not been inspecting the process that I expected to be done. So that's kind of my the worst mindset business thing that I think that I did.
Oh yeah, it is so bad when the owner, the founder, the CEO is the last to know. And that's that. And really, if people are like, well, then tell me earlier. And I'm like, why aren't, and I hear that and I'm in an office with somebody. And I'm like, it is not other people's responsibility to tell you what's going on. It is your responsibility to know what is going on. And that comes back to, I think, if we were to come back all the way to the beginning with the elements of excellence and the few leadership qualities that you had described to us, I think that's a big key piece of it. Responsibility seems to underlie all of them.
Totally does. And not just responsibility, but 100% responsibility. And the distinction there is it's oftentimes, we do this in business relationship, we do it in personal relationship. Yeah, I'll take responsibility for this and this, but this is their fault. And I think as a leader, we need to take 100% responsibility. We may not have been the one that took those actions, but at the very end, we are 100% responsible. And we can't grow, expand, or make improvements unless we look at it from that perspective. Because if there's even that tinge of blame, it's going to get us off center. So both people, in essence, are 100% responsible for their contribution to the company or the relationship. But if you look at things from that perspective, it can be a game changer.
So talk to me about what makes it bold to develop and hone the mindset of a champion.
So you cut out a little bit there, Jess, so I'm going to ask you to repeat that question.
Absolutely. What makes it bold to develop and hone the mind of a champion?
Well, I think the first thing comes with a choice. It's a choice to change. It's a choice to expand. And it comes with that powerful intention. I think also has to be a willingness to learn and grow and change. So you have to have the intention. You have to be willing to be a good student. Anyone who's ever succeeded in martial arts and anyone who's ever succeeded in business and anyone who's ever succeeded in relationship has had to put their ego aside and realize that there's a time to learn. And then the third part of that is you have to take action. It's not about just knowing all the good stuff. You actually have to enact it in your life. And as I shared before, it doesn't necessarily need to be a huge, massive action. For me, what I've learned is things that are done consistently over time. That's where you get the major shifts and the major breakthroughs.
You heard it here, ladies and gentlemen, business owners, people aspiring to the next level of your career. Learn, keep learning, and learn some more. And then reach out to people like Chris. Read his book, which we will link to in the show notes. Listen to what he has to say. By the way, he does great live casts on Facebook. And so follow his business on Facebook to keep building this mindset, to keep understanding. On the surface, it sounds easy, but when we sit down to do it, it requires a discipline, and it requires showing up every day, even when we don't want to. You'll find all the show notes at voiceofboldbusiness.com/P214. That's voiceofboldbusiness.com/P214. P for program 214. You can also search the site for Chris Natzke or Mind of a Champion. It's time for you to keep this conversation going past our 50 minutes together. Tell us what you think. Use hashtag VBB Radio. You're already watching, you're already listening, so leave us a comment. Tell us what you think about this program. Tell us how your stories and your struggles and your successes align with what Chris has shared today so that we can continue to define what it means to be an effective leader. Because it's us. It's us through our actions that do that. Go and develop your mind of a champion.
The voice of Bold Business Radio gives you insights about how to achieve your company's growth strategy. When you aren't seeing the growth results you want, it's time to get an outside perspective. To discuss your specific situation around growth strategy, work with us. Visit voiceofboldbusiness.com and click Find Out More. Special thanks to the Scott Treatment for technical production. Thank you for joining us.